All right. Well, the grasshopper has been taken care of. So let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the lecture. Um, at the end of the last video, we were talking about the general organization of the nervous system. And we said that information that's being delivered to the central nervous system is termed as sensory. And sensory nerves or sensory neurons are neurons that are carrying information in. Motor describes information that is leaving the central nervous system, some kind of a command. Remember, the central nervous system is both the brain and the spinal cord. So even though it's easiest to sort of understand these things in terms of something like, I smell cookies, I realize Sue's made cookies, and I go and get cookies, okay? Even though it's easiest to understand that, we could be talking about completely unconscious information as well, like my hand is burning, and before I even know that I've burned my hand, my spinal cord processes that information and it sends out a motor command to pull my hand back. And by the time my brain knows that I burned my hand is already way back here. And that's known as a reflex. All right. Let's see. But there's more detail. So remember that the somatic senses are not always consciously available to us. The special senses like sight, vision, hearing, most of that information is consciously available to us, not all of it, all right? And with motor, we're going to be mostly thinking about the somatic nervous system. That is moving our muscles, right? So ultimately that is skeletal muscle. However, the central nervous system's motor output acts to cause effects that are not voluntary, and they are part of our autonomic nervous system, right? So we will be talking about that right before we start, the neurophysiology of the eyes and ears and stuff like that. Understanding the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system in particular is going to be important for us to understand how the heart and the respiratory system modulate their output. All right. Yeah, just another picture. Sensory is information going in. And you'll notice that the blue cell that's taking information to the central nervous system is just a different cell from I guess it's a red cell that is carrying the information out. And the purple cells they've got in there, those are the cells that are part of the central nervous system that are doing integration. So if I ask you, what are the three functions of the nervous system? They are sensory, integrative, and motor. Write it down, okay? Now, there are two main categories of cells in nervous tissue, actors in the nervous system. We're going to spend most of our time talking about these guys. These guys, the nerve cells, they're going to get most of our attention. But before we talk about them, we need to talk about cells that are called neuroglial cells or neuroglia. We need to talk about those guys. So nerve cells, they really are the stars of this system. So they are kind of like Beyonce in their importance. However, as talented as Beyonce is, Beyonce does not put on her own concerts, right? She's not the one setting up all the lights. She's not the one that's choreographing all the dancers and training the dancers behind her. She's not playing all of the musical instruments all at the same time. She has got people for that. So you can think of the neuroglia as being all of those supporting people that allow Beyonce to be the star that she is. The neuroglia are often, that's sometimes pronounced neuroglia. People will also simply pronounce them glial cells, and some people will just call them glia, right? When people have got a brain tumor, It very seldom is a tumor of nerve cells. It is almost always going to be a tumor of glial cells, or there are some other cells inside of the brain that can cause tumors. Now, I want you to know these different glial cells and what they do. The glial cells get divided up into central nervous system glial cells and peripheral nervous system glial cells. The only peripheral nervous system glial cell you need to know is the Schwann cell. And if you want to be fancy, people pronounce it Schwann cell because I guess the dude was German. Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, they make something called the myelin sheath. And you may also know this from 150. Myelin is a fatty substance that is organized to create little areas of insulation around the axons of nerve cells. And the way it's organized is in a structure called the myelin sheath. In the peripheral nervous system, so the peripheral is everything outside of the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, that myelin sheath is created by Schwann cells. In the central nervous system, it is created by oligodendrocytes. Ready? Now, there are three other cells of the central nervous system that you need to know. You need to know these guys, microglial cells. Micro means tiny. And so the microglial cells are tiny glial cells. Well, that's not what's important about them. What's important about them is that they are the defenders of the central nervous system. So if you've got an infection of your central nervous system, or if any cells have died in your central nervous system, it will be the microglial cells that will come to the rescue. The way I remember that the microglial cells are the defenders is I think about Bruce Lee. Okay, if you don't know who Bruce Lee is, pause the video, go to YouTube and Google Bruce Lee on YouTube. Okay, so Bruce Lee was one of those movie karate stars, and he was a tiny guy, probably about my size, except for all muscles, super fast and really badass. So I always think of Bruce Lee, little guy defending me. Then we have got the oligodendrocytes. After that, we have the astrocytes. And the astrocytes, they feed and they nourish the nerve cells. The astrocytes are like astrocytes are kind of like the personal assistants to Beyonce. You know how Beyonce, she doesn't go and get her own pumpkin latte from Starbucks or whatever, okay? Beyonce's got people for that. So there might be a person who goes to the Starbucks and picks up the pumpkin latte and makes sure that it's made with non-dairy soy milk or something like that, and make sure it's the right temperature, and then gives it to Beyonce. That is the astrocyte. The astrocyte is going to feed and nourish the nerve cells. And the way I remember this is I think of a dog named Astro. Astro was a dog on the Jetsons. And since you are on YouTube right now, you can pause this and you can go Google a cartoon called The Jetsons. The Jetsons was a space age family set in the future, and they had a dog named Astro. And I think of Astro as being a nice dog. And I would feed and nourish him. So I remember the astrocytes are the cells that feed and nourish the neurons. And then we've got ependymal cells. And the ependymal cells make an epithelial kind of layer that lines all of the meninges. Remember meninges, and remember the lateral ventricles and third and fourth ventricle and the fluid that goes down around the spinal cord. You should remember that from 150. Ependymal cells make that fluid and they line all of those spaces. So know these definitions. Let's look at these guys. Here we've got the ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells, these guys, they're making the cerebrospinal fluid that is filling up the ventricles and flowing down around the spinal cord. Here's our neuron. Here's our little Beyonce there. Our microglial cell. Here's our microglial cell. That's Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee is tiny but badass, like our microglial cell. Here's another one. Oligodendrocytes. The oligodendrocytes, they kind of look like a character. Someone told me they look like a character in Monsters, Inc. The oligodendrocytes, here is the cell, and here is her little cell body, right? And what she's done is she's wrapping her arms around different axons of different neurons, and the oligodendrocyte wraps her arms around them, wrap, 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 and makes the myelin sheath, myelin sheath. And then we've got the astrocyte. The astrocyte, there's her nucleus. Oh, she looks sad. Okay, the astrocyte, she is busy picking up pumpkin lattes, sipping them, deciding they're okay, sending them over to Beyonce. Now, this reminds me to inform you about something called the blood-brain barrier. Those of you who are going into medicine, whether it's PA school or nursing school, the blood-brain barrier is one of those terms that you will hear a lot. So it's one of those things you really should have a mental picture for the blood-brain barrier. And this image is actually starting to show it. So let's talk about it. The blood-brain barrier is a description of how the cells of the nervous system, so all of these cells here, they actually do not trust your blood, which seems a little bit crazy, okay? Every other cell in the human body is going to line themselves up right here, right next to a capillary, so that they can get nutrients and ions and medication, everything directly from the capillary. That's how everywhere else in the body is, but not the central nervous system. The central nervous system is paranoid, probably for good reason. Who knows who's trying to get to Beyonce, stalkers or whatever, okay? So instead of having a naked capillary, this area down here, that's a naked capillary. That's the way capillaries look in almost the entire rest of the body. But in the central nervous system, instead of being naked like that, they look like this. Do you see this part right here? That part right there. If you just look at this part right here, you're like, oh, the foot processes of these astrocytes are pretty much covering the entire capillary. And they are, okay? That is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is not anything you would see when you dissected an animal. It's not anything you would see if you were doing surgery on a patient. The blood-brain barrier is a description of the way the capillaries inside of the central nervous system, instead of being what I describe as naked, meaning it's just simple squamous epithelium with basement membrane on the outside. Instead of that, they've got a whole extra layer of foot processes covering the entire surface. So in the brain, you would not see any capillary because all of the capillaries are covered by these foot processes of the astrocytes. Okay, and that's called the blood-brain barrier. Why is the blood-brain barrier important? The blood-brain barrier is important because it is difficult to get drugs into the central nervous system. So let's just imagine for a moment that you have got a dastardly little bacteria right there. Dastardly. We do not like that bacteria. And the microglial cells are going to try to kill him, but let's imagine those bacteria are just too clever somehow. And so you end up with an infection inside of your central nervous system. And let's imagine that that bacteria is easily killed by antibiotic A, right? There is a significant chance that antibiotic A can kill that bacteria anywhere else in the body, but cannot kill that bacteria in the brain. And the reason would be because not all antibiotics can get through. Antibiotics can easily get through a regular capillary, but there are many antibiotics that cannot get through that blood-brain barrier. There are really good chemotherapy drugs that we cannot use to treat brain cancer because they do not cross the blood-brain barrier. So the selection of antibiotics when we are talking about the central nervous system will be dictated in part by whether the bacteria are sensitive to that particular antibiotic, but largely by whether it can cross the blood-brain barrier. All righty, so I am actually going to start here at the beginning of the next video because it's a really important concept I want to spend some time with.